going to be the real growth opportunity. Like, where can AI support their growth goals, inside an organization? I think is where the real opportunity is going to come in 2025.
So you're suggesting then they starting to pick the low-hanging fruit on efficiency and looking at,
Absolutely.
sort of bottom of the pyramid, sort of low value added tasks. And we're going to see a shift now where AI is going to be a question of where's the competitive advantage going to come out?
Right.
And importantly, how do we change the story around customer engagement or consumer engagement? Welcome to the Insurgent Mindset podcast. Here we are in 2025. I'm Matt Tice.
I'm Rondo Moses from New York City. Happy New Year, Matt.
Happy New Year, Rondo. We're going to talk about some of the big trends to expect for 2025 and how business leaders can adapt to these trends and how to really jump into 2025 with the insurgent mindset. So I'm curious, what's on your list? What are your top five big things to be watching out for this year?
My top five. So, well, number one, I think you would agree with me, is I believe that there's going to be a continued surge in the adoption of AI. I think in 2024, we saw companies and individuals get a lot comfortable, a lot more comfortable with the technology, and I think that's only going to increase in 2025. I think we will probably see more industry related applications of AI from just, individual usages of it. So I think that's going to be a big area, a big trend that we're going to continue to see pushing forward, in 2025. The second one is an interesting one. I think the whole, area of workplace evolution. So, because of the pandemic, we had that big swing to remote work and then hybrid work. And then in 2024, at least in the US, there was a lot of debate about whether employees need to return back to the office full time. And there are companies, certainly some companies, that are really pushing their employees to come back into the office, I think, as of next week. But I do believe that, in the employer value proposition, the employee value proposition has to be built around remote and hybrid work, because a lot of employees are, used to it, like it, especially your Gen Zers. So I think that we're going to continue to see that trend, and toward the stickiness of hybrid work, if not remote work, in companies. I think that's going to be a big one. And I also think, as a part of that as well, there's going to be a large focus on skill development of employees, maybe largely around building AI skills for employees, but skill development, I think, is going to be a big area of focus, for 2025 for companies. I also think that, global supply chain realignment, is also going to be a big trend. Again, I think this is more sort of, after effects of the pandemic and some of the, wars that we experienced over the past couple of years and challenges, global geopolitical challenges. I think that, companies are going to be looking for more nearshoring and regional supply chains, strengthening those, and rather just than thinking about the efficiency of their supply chains, they're thinking about the resiliency of that supply chain to shock. So I think that that's going to be another big area. And as I mentioned, that sort of the geopolitical, realignment is going to be a big deal. I do think that there's going to be more of this push for more, nationalism, and pushing away from globalization. So a deglobalization in some cases, as companies are and leaders are really looking to satisfy the nationalist urge inside their countries. I think that's going to happen. And I just think the last, thing on my mind is, this whole idea around autonomous everything. Whether it's, the self-driving cars, I think we're going to continue to see growth and development there. Drone use. I've been hearing people say they here in the US, people are spotting things in the sky, and leaders are telling them not to worry. But in a lot of cases, they're drones. I know that Amazon has picked up its deliveries apparently with drones, using drones to do that. So I think we're going to see more of that autonomous economy happening in 2025 as well.
Wow, that's quite a list, Rondo. So I agree with most of it, although we're not quite the same on our top five. I think coming, I'll just share my few, but the top of my list also included I labeled it AI maturity, which
Hmm.
it's interesting. So we're now coming into almost year three of AI. So year one was introduction, year two was experimentation. I think this year is going to be more AI maturity, and we're going to be hearing things like artificial general intelligence. Will that sort of break this year? Will we see that shift? So AGI being now the human equivalent or better of artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
There's a lot of speculation about that. I think we're going to hear more about sovereign AI, where um, national investment in AI infrastructure. So particularly India is doing a lot of work there, very interesting work there. We're going to hear about XAI. I think there's a lot of money going into Elon Musk's AI
Mm.
venture, which is really, really fascinating. I think we're going to hear more about how humans and AI come together and interact. We've spoken before about co-intelligence and the role of how individuals in businesses sort of integrate with AI, and
Yeah.
all many leadership and change management challenges around kind of coexisting with AI in the workplace, I think is very interesting too. So lots of territory to explore there. I think you mentioned a little bit the supply chain and globalization. Second on my list is, I think we've all got to sort of step back and look at what happened in 2024 with all these elections. Really, across the board, the incumbents have not been successful in sort of maintaining political power. So it almost politically was the year of the insurgent across most economies. And we had a record number of elections in 2024. So now we have, all of these new individuals coming into power with really bold, often populist, kind of slightly to the right or very far to the right agendas. So that's going to play a big role in across the board. In particular, trade, I think, will play a really interesting role in terms of trade relationships. Obviously, we'll see if there's a trade war that kicks off at the end of the month, and we'll
You're
find
right.
out what happens there. That could be destabilizing across the economy. And obviously, the off-flow impacts of kind of resurgence of inflation, the tightening up or disruption of supply chains, particularly for critical minerals, for example. I know that China has been pulling back on making those available. So we're almost kind of at the moment in a cold trade war, which could turn into something much more significant. So I'm really worried about that.
Right.
Another outflow of the populist sort of agenda is what I'm terming climate 180. I think it's very likely, for example, that the U.S. will pull out of Paris again. And certainly globally, we're not on track to meet the thresholds to keep climate in check. So that's another factor. Whether or not that will gather steam or go the other way, I don't know. And we may see, for example, a nuclear renaissance that comes on the back of that. Here in Australia, there's a lot of political discussion about the role of nuclear going forward, and
Mm.
whether or not that's a viable alternative. And certainly, probably for the first time in 2 or 3 decades, we've now got some significant innovation and investment going into alternative nuclear technology, which I think is very interesting. Then, of course, the wild card, the two big wild cards for me, nuclear fusion, to stay on that track. We've seen over the last sort of 24 months some pretty significant breakthroughs there. Now, I don't expect that to reach any mainstream within 5 or even 10 years, but we may see significant more amount of investment going there. And then, of course, quantum computing, which
Right.
also is starting to break some records, and we may see the germination of practical application of quantum computing in towards the end of 2025, where we haven't perhaps seen that yet. So all these things kind of come together. It creates a very fertile and interesting sort of environment in which to be operating this year. So one last thing I'd like to mention, I think, is the geopolitics of, we have this still the situation in the Middle East, which is reaching varying stable. We can make an argument that that's reaching some sort of stasis. I'm not convinced about that. And of course, in Europe with Ukraine and Russia, that could break in a positive way with that situation being resolved, or it could go the other way with Ukraine collapsing. Either way, it creates really interesting geopolitical challenges, particularly as these polar alliances start to develop. We've got soldiers fighting in Ukraine from North Korea. It's something quite unprecedented. So we'll have to see how all that plays out.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we had a number of different areas where we were in alignment.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with AI, Rondo? Here we are, 2025, AI is almost pervasive. More than a third of businesses and probably half of individuals are using AI in some meaningful way.
Way.
Just about every company has their AI strategy at some level of development. So, and we've of course been doing some of that work with clients as well. And it's an interesting year to look ahead in terms of what AI maturity might really look like for firms. So do you have any predictions in terms of how that might unfold?
Well, I mean, I think to your point, I think that there is going to be more maturity in the space. I think that although some companies experimented with AI over the past couple of years, I don't think that a lot of companies actually have explicit AI strategies, or AI has not been integrated into their strategy. So I think we're going to start to see more companies actually do that, actually integrating AI into their business strategy, and not just from an efficiency point of view. I think they're going to be thinking about it through the lens of the customer journey and customer engagement. So I think that that's going to be the real growth opportunity. Like, where can AI support their growth goals, inside an organization? I think is where the real opportunity is going to come in 2025.
So you're suggesting then they starting to pick the low-hanging fruit on efficiency and looking at,
Absolutely.
sort of bottom of the pyramid, sort of low value added tasks. And we're going to see a shift now where AI is going to be a question of where's the competitive advantage going to come out?
Right.
And importantly, how do we change the story around customer engagement or consumer engagement?
The way I've heard most companies leaders talk about how they've directed their teams and their individuals to use AI is figure out the tasks where AI could do it for you that would make you more efficient, that would free you up. The more repetitive tasks that you're currently doing. And that's how people have been using it. A lot of people using them to help with emails and processes that they do that are pretty repetitive. They've been trying to use AI for those kinds of things. And I think now the opportunities for them is to figure out how do they use AI to connect and engage with customers. And I think that's where the focus is going to shift in 2025 and beyond. And I also think that you're going to see more industry specific applications of AI than we've
Hmm.
seen over the last couple of years. So I think that those are going to be the two emerging trends that we're going to see this year.
Sure. And I think we could probably, if we worked really hard, and it would take probably 5 podcasts, but I think we could certainly illustrate an application of AI across every part of every value chain in every company on the planet, right?
Hmm.
So, these examples or the cases are out there. It's now just mainstreaming all these cases, everything from, to your point, customer engagement to supply chain to the legal office to
Right.
finance, whatever. It's virtually pervasive across, not inside most enterprises. Most enterprises have picked areas where they're going to focus. But, as you look across the economy, virtually almost every part of the value chain of every company will be affected in some way by AI. So I think to your point about sort of stepping back and really understanding what that means strategically is going to be really important. I think the other thing is that because we now have this convergence of incredible computing power, we're
Right.
also seeing the AI utility problem, which is the dominance of a relatively few firms with quite a lot of power here. So I think there'll be an interesting question for regulators. To what degree are they going to play a role in that? And then also we have, the rise of these small language models in particular, where, AI on a device, it might be your phone. We have the Apple Intelligence sort of has just kicked off, and that sort of containerized, sort of firm-specific, very, very focused models are being developed for particular applications. So that plays an interesting role too.
Hmm.
So I think, it is sort of evolving in different ways, but I think the advice I'd give business leaders is to have an AI strategy, which is deeply integrated in your business strategy, which sort of makes that pivot, which is essentially, where is the competitive advantage going to come from our AI investments, and how can we use that opportunity to make those investments to break from the pack? And I think that's different than just seeking harvest of efficiencies in low
Right.
value added tasks. So I think
But
that
but I
is
also but I also think your point about that connection between AI and humans is going to be an important one too. I mean, just the whole idea of thinking about creating or viewing AI as your assistant in terms of helping you professionally, and what are the different job roles for that assistant as you use them professionally or even personally, right? So I
it may
think
not just be assistant. I mean, there'll be AI playing the increasingly AI will find itself into leadership roles, Rondo, right?
yeah.
So I was I gave a talk to a group in Adelaide in the middle of last year, and there was a woman who shared her experience where they had created a virtual board member using AI, which was fascinating just to understand, hear that story, and listen to her talk about her experience in sort of standing up an artificial director. I thought that was really interesting.
That's very interesting.
Well, that's not really kind of not mainstream yet, but I think we're going to see that, and I think that that sort of human AI interaction is going to be probably the big change management challenge of the next 5 years, in terms of just how do we deal with it? How do we help, how do we help junior people come into the organizations, interact with AI? How do you help senior leaders and directors deal with it? And what does it mean on the shop floor, if you will, in
Right.
terms of how the technology interfaces with individuals? And I think that'll be really interesting.
Well, I think your point is a great one because it also reinforces why there's some people are so concerned about the growth of robots. And with AI's continued, maturation, the use of robots is only going to increase. But not just in, manufacturing, but in other aspects of business, you're going to start to see robots more. And I don't think it's something that will happen right away this year. But I do think that that is going to be a trend, which is why people are nervous about AI's adoption and what that means for employees and unemployment, et cetera. But because potentially it is a threat down the road, if you can create these robots that can do, in essence, act as assistants for leaders or even staff inside your organization, it creates a threat long term for people.
Right. And I think it's interesting when you sort of stand back and look at the macroeconomic challenges of all the other things happening, right? So if you look at labor policy issues, maybe in the US and in particular in the UK,
Hmm.
maybe to a lesser degree Europe, and it is a factor here in Australia as well with immigration, and to what degree are certain jobs going to be looked after by technology? Are they going to be looked after by immigrants? Are they
Right.
going to go away? I think there's a huge, massive conversation to be had about kind of how labor is going to evolve, and the role of the technology, but also the role of labor supply. And you mentioned earlier labor mobility as well, which plays a key role in driving productivity. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not the metrics around, national productivity evolve to sort of capture these trends, because, we haven't really seen in some economies anyway, in the UK and Australia, productivity is down or at least flat, whereas
Hmm. Hmm.
in the US that productivity has increased. we're not sure yet whether AI or labor mobility or what are the factors really driving that bump. And but productivity is a major issue sort of on a global basis. And I think for firms as well is, how do you make sure that you're capturing and harvesting these benefits to, make your value added more productive, I think
Right.
is a key issue. So we haven't really learned how to measure this yet. I think that's a factor that we've got to work on.
Right. And I think the challenge for organizations is to see this as an opportunity to maybe rethink the roles that they currently have. So what is the role of the human in a process versus the AI or technology in the process? So it's an opportunity to think about how do you upskill and that's why when I said workforce is a trend, because I think that they have to think about not just remote and hybrid, but also workforce development in terms of what are the skills that they need to upgrade themselves to make themselves more competitive and viable in this emerging environment.
I agree, Rondo. I went back and read a few papers at the tail end of the pandemic, which was the quote unquote future of work was a very popular sort of thought leadership area for a little while. And a
Hmm.
lot of that was related to remote working and in particular sort of reacting, if you will, to how the pandemic changed work. But I think, there's a much more interesting conversation around AI to be had in terms of what the future of work is and from through the whole, if you will, value chain of work.
Right.
It's really interesting. I think it's going to change all of it, and I think a lot of us who've written those papers have to step back and sharpen our pencils, have another go at this because it's not only is it not going to be the same, but I think it's profoundly different in terms of how we lead organizations, particularly as if you will, the clock speed of these changes keeps increasing and increasing. And our ability to sort of adapt and evolve to these changes has been historically relatively slow. So we have to move much more quickly. And I think that this will lead to a pretty significant breakdown of what I would describe as traditional vertical command and control hierarchies in firms, and
Hmm. Hmm.
create a much more horizontal, much flatter, and much more necessarily flat structure where businesses have to respond on the ground at the coalface in the conversation with the customer in a much more emergent way. So we don't know how to lead like that, really, Rondo, as
Right.
society, and I think that's going to be one of the big challenges is reprogramming leadership to be able to adapt to this change.
So, you made this point and made me think about I watched this series over the break. I don't know if you've seen it. It's Squid Games. It's on Netflix. And in the object of the game is that most of these people been brought there, are basically in debt. And this game organizer, who they have no idea who the person is giving them an opportunity to win, billions of dollars. This is in South Korea, billions of dollars. And so they bring them, I think they start off with like something like 456 players in this
No spoiler
game.
alerts here, Rondo.
No, but the idea is that, well, I'll just give you one. In one of the games, one team decides that the key to success is basically you get all men, because they think it's just about strength. And you have like a leader, he's really driving it. This other team has a mix of women, they have a couple older people on it. And the idea there was we're all one team. And so let's just put our collective heads together to figure out how we win. So it gets back to your point about, you decentralize the ideas and the leadership as opposed to being driven from the top. In that first team, it was like coming from the strong man on the team, sort of dictating what they did. And in this
Mm,
other team, it was all about sort of figuring out who has the best idea and let's go with that. And it turned out that the older person had the best idea, and that's ultimately why they were successful in that event. So it was
right.
really interesting.
So lots of work to do there. So at the risk of over-indexing our conversation on AI, let's move into some additional territory, trade policy. So we've got, I'm very worried about a global trade war, which, this could kick
Yeah.
off in a matter of months, which, will reverberate I think, what do you think will be some of the main, um, one of the main outflows of a trade war? Obviously, we'll see inflationary pressures rise again, which
Right.
will be problematic in lots of ways. We'll see, you mentioned earlier, supply chain constraints will come back, which not only again will be inflationary, but also, create a situation of uncertainty for firms trying to build resilience in the supply chains. And of course,
Hmm.
these things don't happen overnight. You can't just shift a supply chain that's dominant, for example, on China to Vietnam, or even localization of that supply chain overnight. That's virtually impossible. So whilst that's happening, and it's certainly a trend, it's not something that we can adapt to in the very short term. What else do you think will sort of, or do firms need to watch out for in terms of these global trade ebbs and flows over the next year?
Well, I think the supply chain is a big one. I mean, I know, for example, one of my big clients out of Mexico, during the pandemic, they made a concerted effort to really define their supply chain closer to their market. And post the pandemic, they sort of made a strategic decision to maintain that sort of more regional, local, nearshore supply chain focus because they wanted to have that resiliency in their supply chain. I think that companies that sort of went back to business as usual post the pandemic are going to be at risk because at least from the perspective of the US, I mean, I think this new administration coming in is going to, honor some of those commitments they made during the campaign. And we're going to have, tariff wars. I know the new president of Mexico and the incoming president-elect have had some, back and forth words. So there's going to be challenges for companies who are trying to do business probably in Mexico, who are, importing from Mexico, et cetera. There's going to definitely be some challenges. So I do think the whole issue of tariffs will be a challenging one. And so if companies haven't invested the effort in thinking about becoming much more of a regional supply chain focus, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for them. And there's a lot of risk. But,
Mm.
at the flip side, though, is, we have a lot of optimism here from corporate CEOs, small business leaders. They are very optimistic about the economy going into 2025. Now, that just could be because of, their expectation around some of the regulatory policies. Maybe there'll be looser regulatory constraints. There will be more, more pro-growth policies that would be implemented, but they're certainly a lot more optimistic than they have been in the past about the economy and their business than they have been in the past couple of years.
Well, you have two competing triple plays, right? So you have the negative triple play of tariffs, immigration constraint, and what I would call a debt-fueled fiscal, kind of economy, which is really problematic in the middle to long term, particularly with inflation, right? And then you have the benefits of deregulation, as you pointed out. You also have the benefits potentially, as we mentioned, of technology, which will play a key role. And then
Hmm.
also, related to the first point, the renegotiation of some of these bilateral and multilateral trade regimes like NAFTA 3.0, which is virtually inevitable, whether or not that will create more opportunities for national businesses, particularly in the US, that will play a role. But virtually everyone else on the planet is looking at all of this saying, this is, well, we'd like to think it's not a zero-sum game. The I win, you lose sort of approach is definitely going to create an imbalance in lots of economies, some of which are
Yeah.
really struggling. I point out maybe the UK in particular as an economy that's been on the back foot for a relatively long time, hasn't been able to find its feet. These sorts of changes are not going to help. So I think, I'm trying to look at this from a global point of view a little bit, but I think it
But what do
is.
you think is going to happen in Australia based on some of the policies potentially coming out of the US? What would be the impact on Australia?
It's early to tell, right? So I think right now already we're seeing the Australian dollar is under a lot of pressure. It's come off maybe 5% in the last 2 or 3 months. dipped below 60 cents to the US dollar for the first time in a couple of years, which is a bit of a worry. So that's a big factor. And we're probably more sensitive to what's happening in China here in Australia than we are to what's
Okay.
happening in the US. But to the degree to which those two are related, so, and also with AUKUS, which is, we're aligned politically to the US, particularly from a security point of view, which creates an awkward position for Australia, which is quite economically tied to China. And China
Hmm.
is definitely off the boil. So, China has been relatively flat comparatively, and the yuan has had a bit of a challenge over the last little while as well. So, I would say that the outlook for Australia is fragile. We've been in a,
Hmm.
kind of a consumer recession for about 7 quarters, and you know, really the only thing holding us out of that, a more technical recession has been immigration and capital inflows, which has created other problems in terms of
Right.
affordability of housing and other things that inflation, et cetera, which has caused pain for households in Australia. So, but somehow we always seem to manage to pull out of these global imbalances and come out stronger. So I'm optimistic that we'll play a role. The big wild card in Australia is political. Whether or not we have a also and the incumbent here loses. We're about 6 months or 9 months behind the cycle of the rest of the world in the elections here. So
Okay.
a very real possibility we could experience a hard shift to the right here in Australia, which would take on a little bit more of a populist characteristic, um,
Hmm.
which we'll see. I can't predict what will happen, but it looks like it'll be a close one. That should happen.
So is your impression right now that the right is very motivated? Like there's a real possibility here that the right could win?
Well, it's virtually similar to almost every other economy, Canada, France, UK, where the incumbent in a situation where we've had inflation, we've had higher cost of living,
Right.
blah, 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 the incumbent's going to be under pressure in this next election. I don't think that in Australia, the political system is immune from kind of what I would describe as a populist tendency for various reasons. We have a different voting system, compulsory voting, which tends to create a slightly higher um, political understanding and awareness in the population, which
Hmm.
therefore then you get probably a more centrist approach. But we're not immune, and we'll see what happens. But it's going to be a weird year this year. So I think from a business point of view, um, probably not unlike what you've experienced in the U.S., the switch to a more conservative sort of approach politically will probably be welcomed. But on the other hand, we'll lose some ground on some of the other things that perhaps we made some good progress on, climate, DEI, and other things.
Are there any industries when you think about the Australian market, are there any industries that you think are potentially more prone or trending more toward disruption in 2025 and beyond than that have been in the past?
Well, I guess it depends on what type of disruption. So if we stick with global trade, and China in particular, the biggest issue here in Australia are resources, iron ore, for example, or coal, where obviously the Australian dollar plays a big role in that. The demand for Australian resources, again, particularly in Asia and China in particular, if that comes off the boil, that has a major impact on our economy here. Similarly
Mhm.
for agriculture. And then the rest of the economy, we take financial services, we take technology, education, health, reasonably similar to the rest of the world in terms of the challenges. So, for example, in health, we have obviously an aging population here, which plays a key role in that. We've talked about health on a previous podcast, some of these challenges, in terms of the affordability of healthcare at a national level, big role, the role of technology change in healthcare, et cetera. So there's a lot of disruption happening in health just in general, which is largely driven by demographics and affordability, and
Hmm.
to a degree, the increase of technology. And we could go through all of them basically, Rondo, but you know, in Australia, I think we have a very resource intensive economy here, which the elephant in the room is what's happening in China and to what degree that'll play a role in the ebbs and flows of global trade in and out of China, in and out
Yeah.
of Australia from China.
Well, I think here in the U.S., given the incident we had with the CEO of United Healthcare, I think healthcare is going to be top of mind for a lot of people over in
Hmm.
2025. I'm not sure how much change we'll see, but I think there will be a lot more conversations this year than there were last year.
Yeah, perhaps for our listeners who aren't in the U.S., Rondo, maybe you could give us just a quick, a précis on that. What happened?
Yeah, so what happened was the CEO of United Healthcare was killed in early December. It was a lone vigilante who apparently was very disgruntled with the insurance industry, and he somehow knew where he would be. He was attending an investor meeting in New York, and at one of the hotels in Manhattan. And he waited for him and spotted him, and shot him in the back a couple of times. And it's been amazing how the social media support for this guy has been off the charts. And a lot of people going saying how attractive he is. I have close friends who are saying, "Oh, well, he's such a good-looking guy, why why should he go to jail?" There's some people are so upset around what they believe is just the overcharging, the brokenness of the healthcare system here, that they are embracing this guy as a hero. That's
Mm.
really the challenge that we have. And so I think that in 2025, and since then, companies have really taken their names of their leadership teams off their websites to, prevent any sort of copycat move. But
Mm.
there's this movement toward, I didn't see a lot of people sympathizing with the CEO and his family that, he's gone. This father and his husband is gone. So there's a lot that we've got to do around the healthcare system here. And I think based on what happened, I'm hoping that people will take it seriously and really try to figure out, some changes that can be made.
Rondo, I think, that healthcare is interesting, but think there's maybe a wider conversation to be had there about the role of populism in business and to what degree, that's playing a role in how people are interacting with firms. I think that, I hear the healthcare side of that, but is there a wider story here in terms of how individuals are attempting to hold firms accountable for their behavior in perhaps very unproductive ways? Is that something we need
Well,
to be worried about in 2025?
that's a great point. For sure in healthcare, I think in insurance companies, for sure, because there's such a lack of trust of insurance companies, lack of trust of hospitals. People feel like there's a lack of transparency there. So I do believe that there's a lot of work that has to be done to build public trust around our healthcare system, and that's not something that's going to happen overnight. Whether that, also extends into other industries, probably. I'm not sure which ones right now. I know people are, again, very concerned about, price inflation, but during the height of the inflation, they were blaming government. Less so the corporations that was actually raising the prices. So I'm not sure. We'll see.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting risk to be monitoring, both in terms of, how vulnerable not only is the leadership, but how vulnerable is the firm to these kind of broader forces. I think that's something we should be paying attention to here in 2025, and perhaps also, starting to think a little bit about, what does it all mean in terms of how firms align themselves to the political environment also. I know that
Hmm.
sort of 2022, 23, a little bit 2024, there was this dynamic where firms seemed to have to, at least in the US, make a choice whether they were going to align red, align blue, or try to stay on the fence. I think
Hmm.
that's an interesting question both for marketers and for, corporate communications people. To what degree do do firms are able are how are firms able to maintain that neutrality in this increasingly polarized environment? I think it's interesting, and I think from a point of view of really understanding how consumers and customers are thinking, purchasing and engaging. To your earlier point when we were talking about AI, I think that puts another interesting ingredient into the mix.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hmm. Okay. Okay, well, good. Let's talk for a minute about what to expect this year on the Insurgent Mindset. I think we're going to have a big year. A couple of changes to our format. We can anticipate we'll start bringing on some high-profile guests to share their stories about how they've applied the Insurgent Mindset to make their firms more competitive. So look out for that this year. What else are we going to bring to the audience this year, Rondo?
I think, we want to reach out to our community and get their thoughts on, industries they'd like to hear us talk about, companies, different ideas or strategies. So I think the idea of getting, content from the audience in terms of what they want us to talk about, I think is going to be a big push in 2025 as well.
Okay, terrific. Well, I'm looking forward to this year. I think it'll be challenging, it'll be interesting, and I think, just to close, I think the insurgent mindset really is to look at all of this change and look at these trends and to see the cracks and the opportunities where others are perhaps playing defense, you can play offense. And I think
Absolutely.
as you start your planning for 2025, if you haven't already, looking across this tapestry of opportunity should be your prime motivator, I think, to seek ways to create your own disruption and your own advantage.
Yeah, this is the perfect time to step back and say, are we sort of, operating under business as usual? Are we really aligning ourselves to the changes happening in the environment?
Well, let's look forward to a fun and prosperous year ahead, Rondo, and hopefully we'll be back in a couple of weeks to get back on the horse and talk a little bit about our next big challenge.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, all the best for 2025, Rondo.
Likewise, Matt.